Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today here in the John Hope Franklin Center by John Akomfrah, who is a founding member of the influential Black audio film collective, which started in London in 1982, alongside the artists David Lawson and Lina Gopaul, his still longtime collaborators with Smoking Dog Films. Akomfrah's groundbreaking film, The Last Angel in History, is recognized as a seminal and foundational piece in a movement that we call Afrofuturism. Among his most recent works, there includes the 3-screen installation, The Unfinished Conversations, a moving portrait of the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, and Precarity, a new 3-channel video installation, a meditation on the life of jazz artist Buddy Bolden, which debuted at Prospect 4, the Lotus in Spite of the Swamp in New Orleans in November of 2017, and is currently installed at the Duke University National Museum. Akomfrah joins us after delivering the annual Rothschild Lecture at Nasher. How are you doing, John?
I love your voice, Mark. I just realized how much I missed it. I'm good. I'm good.
Talk a little bit about what brings you to Buddy Bolden. You know, it's just, and this is the case with all of your films, I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. And the film gets to take advantage of the beauty of New Orleans. Yes. And then you have this story which in some ways we don't have a lot of access to, right? There's not a whole lot of music.
No.
There's not a whole lot of, there's not, you know, there's not film footage, no. there's not. Right. And so you piece together this very moving portrait of this foundational figure of jazz that we simply don't talk about enough.
No.
And you place him in a really extraordinary context. So talk a little bit about how you got to Bolden's story.
Well, I mean, you know, I made a film on Louis Armstrong about 12 years ago. And at the time, I was convinced that Armstrong was the foundational figure of jazz.
He was a god, right?
And a couple of years afterwards, I remember coming across the Michael Ondaatje book, Coming Through Slaughter, and which is a sort of fictional account, essentially, of the life of Bolden. And I thought, hang on, didn't we just do the
right.
father of jazz?
That's right.
Who is this other guy?
Who's this other guy? Right?
And that's when the interest in him started. I mean, he is, in a way, also interesting for me because he's a kind of emblematic diasporic figure.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Like the historical traces are thin. Yeah. The presence is fragile, precarious, but you know he's there. Yeah. Because he's left this kind of ghost line, right, of his presence in the music. Yeah. You know, everyone acknowledges him, but in terms of the sort of monuments and the tangible things, nothing. And that's pretty much symptomatic of the African diaspora.
I mean, when you speak of kind of like ghost-like figures, the voice of W.E.B. Du Bois, right, yes. and the way it figures in the film, you know, beginning with this idea of the two warring souls, yes. you know, double consciousness, and as the film lays out this kind of 6 dynamics of what double consciousness is. And one of the things the film did for me that I don't think we talk about a lot, when we talk about Du Bois, we're always talking about what Du Bois means to me or us, right? We don't do a whole lot of work on how folks in that early period are actually experiencing Du Bois, right, as he's writing this stuff, right? And so one of the things you do is actually to bring Buddy Bolden in the early 20th century really in conversation with how folks might have been experiencing Du Bois at that moment.
Indeed.
Also.
Well, I mean, and what's even more important for me was how they might have been experiencing Du Bois as a necessary counterpoint in an ongoing debate about whether you protest against your conditions, Du Bois, or accommodate yourself to it, Washington. Booker Washington. So the two figures are absolutely central as sort of polar affective poles, if you will, emotional pools on black psyches at that point. And it is that point because The Souls of Black Folk is written in 1905. 1905, Buddy Bolden was the best thing, the best musical thing we knew. You know, so it was important and feels important that that conversation should happen, not just between Bolden and Du Bois, which is really important to me.
Right.
But also Washington, who was Du Bois's nemesis.
Right.
I think it's a legitimate conversation.
Absolutely.
I think it's a very legitimate conversation.
When you talk about these 6 aspects of double consciousness, the first one is fluidity.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that and thinking about both double consciousness, obviously, but also in the case of the life of someone like Buddy Bolden.
I mean, you know, one of the things Du Bois wanted to stress with this notion of a double consciousness was the idea that there was this veil.
Yeah, right.
You know, this veil that divides your world into these two Manichaean halves. Now, clearly, the psyche of color, the black psyche, needs to navigate that.
Right.
And that requires a certain agility and fluidity.
Right.
It requires movement,
Right.
essentially, across these both conceptual, emotional, affective, and political lines. You know, you needed to know when to pull back across the tracks. You know, you needed to know when it was important to stay in the moment and when it was important to back off. You know.
And that's also reflected in one of the themes that you talk about in terms of fugitivity.
Indeed.
Right.
Indeed.
This idea of having to constantly decamp and be on the move.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you, part of the multi-screen piece has a series of photographs, and one of them that one series that I'm really keen on was of people arrested in New Orleans at the turn of the century. So they've got these mug shots of them, and so I'm doing things with them with water and stuff. But what's interesting to me is their demeanor. Okay, now when you watch them, one guy in particular looks a little bit like Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
But not just looks like him, you could tell that he could be Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And it's that's the fugitivity that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the inherited traces of certain gestures that are only inherited because you're prepared to move and search for them.
Right.
You know? Outside of the norms. Because if you, to be honest with you, you know, we were just driving down and I saw this sign saying, who's the guy that we saw? Baseball player.
Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson way. Yeah.
Okay, now here is for me a classic definition of fugitivity, you know, in black culture, right? So there is this thing called baseball, and there's a mainstream version and something else.
Negro Leagues, right? Yeah.
You know, clearly, you know, the Negro League is a fugitive option.
Right.
People have taken, but it's a space of excellence.
Right.
You know, and it's an excellence that can then be packaged. You know, or you look at Beyonce at Coachella, you know, and people say, oh, she's got this black college thing. Well, those spaces are spaces of excellence.
Of genius, and that they have provided for the culture.
Indeed.
Right. You look at Buddy Bolden's career, and you're really talking about a 9-year period. Right, where he's at the absolute peak of what we would think
Can
about
I have a sip of this?
Yeah, of course. You know, when we think of black excellence, right, there's this 9-year period at his peak. It ends by the time he's 30 years old.
Yeah.
And so we can't even imagine what that genius would have been like, fully fulfilled, you know, as he matured. And one of the things I thought was interesting about what you do with him in the film are these moments where he comes face to face with a phonograph. And it's like he's trying to imagine what his future is going to be like, right, with this new technology that changes his experience, right? Because for him, it's sitting there in these spaces and playing for the people, and the phonograph is threatening to change the nature of that relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, this is, oftentimes when you make these things, in the main, you're trying to say things that you think can come across, but some things are just too complicated. so they're really there because you're having a private conversation with it.
Right.
And the phonograph, the presence of that phonograph is a really important moment for me in Precarity, because it's a moment of agency.
Yeah.
Right. Not necessarily in a good way, but an agency all the same. Because one of the reasons why so little was recorded of these figures was because of a kind of fear, antipathy to the recording device itself. People felt that if they lent their presence to it by recording, it would be ripped off, somebody would steal it, and,
Right.
you know, so that
Which all was true. Yes. Right. It's like,
okay,
right, very precious, right?
The net result of that was that the first recordings were made by the Dixieland band, who had no such fear, no such antipathy. You know, so these are kind of complicated moments that I wanted to find a way of just hinting at. It might not come across to most people, but it's okay because it needed to be there. We needed to say, you know, here's a man at the crossroads, if you like.
Because there's a way. I mean, because we're dealing with this extant archive.
Yes.
Right. We don't actually know how full that genius was. We just get resonances of it, right? Folks responding to it, you know, whatever recordings we might have. But to talk about that 9-year period again, right? What does it say about the ability to maintain a level of genius and brilliance as an artist in the Americas? That, you know, is there something about trying to maintain that means if you're Buddy Bolden, you end up in a mental institution for the last 25 years of your life?
This is, you know, this is one of the things that I've gone over again and again in my head. There is resonance. There's a certain kind of resonance in the example of Bolden.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the faithful example of Bolden. Too many.
Yeah.
Where there's a Sly Stone here or a Marvin Gaye here. You know, I mean, there's something. I was trying to explain this to a friend yesterday. You know, the more I've got to know about our music, the more you realize that there's a window of opportunity. And some of the really brilliant ones are aware when that window exists. Coltrane, I believe, knew.
Right. And so I'm,
this is it.
Coltrane does not nearly matter as much recording, say, like in 1978, than he did recording in 1964.
Oh, man. And there is that sonship moment when the brother just thinks, okay, I ain't gonna be around for long. Now, I don't know how he knows that, but you can clearly see there's a kind of velocity to the attack, which really just ups the ante in the last 3 years. Like he records like crazy, you know. Sometimes with Alice, sometimes with McCoy, Tony, I mean,
documenting all of this
documenting, you know, in the basement they built this thing and he was just going, you know, because he could sense the waning of the light, if you will. I think there is a window. I really do. I mean, the numbers of people, the late Beethoven string quartets or, you know, the late James, these are few and far between. Miles is few and far between. Most of it is in the window. There's really just that window of opportunity. A decade if you're really, really lucky. You know, so in a very real sense, there's a way in which that decade Bolden gave us is probably what he was going to
do.
Anyway.
Because you look at someone like Stevie Wonder, right? And we could talk about the longevity of the career, but some of that, it's like, you know, and this is almost blasphemous to say about Stevie Wonder, but it's, you know, Stevie Wonder as caricature. Right? We're never going to get the Stevie Wonder that gave us Innervisions or Fulfilling This First Finale, you know, which I would argue are better than Songs in the Key of Life, even though we talk about that in the way that we talk about it.
But do you remember how long we waited? I remember, like, we waited for 3 years for that final album in that great series to come out. And when it came out, you know, Journey Through a Secret Life, you thought, man, I wish you'd done this earlier. it just felt like it had taken too long, you know. And I don't know, maybe part of it is also he's realizing that the time was up, the delaying of that moment when it might, because of the reasons given at the time just didn't seem to make sense. You know, oh, he's designing a perfume cover. And, oh, man, just give us the album. We don't want to smell it, we want to hear it. And when it came out, something had gone. You know what I mean? You just felt it. Now, I mean, I'm not sure at 16 I could have articulated that. But you sensed it. There was a sense that the spirit
something had lost. Whatever it was in that moment, the moment had moved, he had moved.
You know,
the forces have changed, the stakes, the financial stakes. Had changed.
And you always kind of know it. I mean, same with Marley. You know, there was a moment when you heard that last album and you thought, Sorry. You know, somebody
Yeah.
else had the
Right,
torch. Somebody
right.
else was doing it. I don't know how that moment of unending or of ending becomes. I don't know. I
right.
don't know what. I don't think it's a law of nature or anything.
Yeah.
You know, but I know that it happens. The tragedy for us was that we don't have the arc of Bolden. Can't, you know,
Right, right.
because there's no
Right,
record of it.
'cause there's no
you know.
right.
That's the tragedy for me. It
Right.
would have been interesting to hear what early jazz thought was the height,
Right.
and when it faded.
You know, when you hear in the film and it's like the shrieks and the screams,
Yeah.
and you hear the voiceover saying, it's like, I hear this voice talking to me.
Yeah.
So I just played louder and I played more.
Yeah.
Right. And how much of that innovation is him already processing all kinds of dynamics around mental health that we know in the United States, regardless of race, they didn't have a good handle on. And if you were black in particular, right, you know, the idea of dealing with quote unquote crazy black people, and the silence, right, this idea of silence. I mean, look, the music obviously is silent after that, but you can imagine just him sitting someplace as the film depicts.
Yes. I mean, the person who I was thinking about the most in those periods was Mingus. You know, because Mingus's bipolarity is very different from the Parkers or, you know, enough. Mingus and the great pianist whose name
Bud Powell, right? Guthrie Ramsey did that great book about it a few years ago. Yeah.
I mean, there is clearly, and this is a moot point. It's a complicated question to deal with. How much of the grasp of polyphony, advanced polyphony, right, and its practice echoes phases in bipolarity. How much of it? Which it's not to pathologize the music. It's not even to suggest that you need to be crazy to make the music.
Right.
But there's clearly a kind of affinity,
Right.
an elective affinity, if you will.
Donny Hathaway, right?
Yeah. You know, pianist again, Monk.
Right.
You know,
Right.
too much.
Yeah.
The presence is quite pronounced.
Yeah.
And at some point, so somebody certainly more perceptive than me,
Right.
he's gonna have to come
to.
yeah, he's gonna have to figure out
Yeah.
what the relationship is. But so there were these figures who would clinically be defined as insane
Right.
in the music,
Right.
who were not just musicians, jobby musicians, but pioneers in the evolution of the form. And in a way, and it's a big if Bolden was bipolar or schizophrenic, I mean, let's not forget that these terms are themselves evolving categories for understanding.
For how we think about these things.
You know, but if he was any of those things, he certainly has a long line in the music of people very similar.
Right.
You know, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, to think that jazz finally found a home for crazies, that in itself would be an achievement. You know, when no other.
It's the Branford Marsalis album, Crazy People Music, from a few years ago. It's like,
That in itself would be an achievement.
let's talk a little bit about your career. I look at a figure like Kahlil Joseph, who I see as one of your children, and talking
Kahlil.
about. But he's found this ground in which, in order to continue to work as an experimental artist, he's also doing commercial work, right? So whether it's, you know, his work with Beyonce or other folks, it seems as though you've been able to not have to make that choice, and can continue to do the kind of films. And it's interesting because, you know, at Smoking Dogs, I mean, y'all work like rappers. It's like, what you working on? Well, we got this project, that project. I mean, it's like, okay, this is like hip hop or something, right? So
I love
clearly y'all are busy, but you're making the kind of films you want to make without having to make concessions, you know, to some of the commercial pressures that other folks, you know, in this moment particularly have to.
I mean, the cultures are different. You know, Kahlil, AJ, Malik, Saeed, these are people I grew up with.
Right.
You know, well, Kahlil is our son, but
Right.
but AJ,
But
Malik,
AJ, right,
certainly,
right.
you know, grew up together, made things together in the 80s and 90s. The culture's different. Listen, I mean, you know, there are, other than 1 or 2 music videos that we worked on for the Fugees clan, you know, in particular Lauren, many of them not released because they were made at the time when she was, you know, and I mean, I'm not.
I'm sitting here thinking about, wow, Lauryn Hill and John Akomfrah.
Oh, it was amazing. She was extraordinary. I mean, she was then the most extraordinary person
absolutely.
I had ever met.
Right. And we can frame her in the same way we talk about Buddy Bolden, right? In that context.
I mean, Lauryn Hill was extraordinary then. She probably still is. I mean, we're nominally still in contact. So it's not like we made an effort to stay away.
Gotcha.
A couple of times I put my feet in that water, but I mean, I'm not here. It's too far to come.
Right, no, I got you. I got you.
And you play with the cards you're dealt with, bro.
Internet,
you know,
right,
you just think, okay, well, we're in England. This is what we've got to do, and we do that. And there's also the demographic difference, which is huge. You know, like if you work on a Beyonce track, and it opens millions, see, across the planet. We don't have the equivalent in Europe. You just don't. There is, you know, the African diaspora finds its most profound expression, both in numerical and musical terms. It seems to me here. You know, so it is both a blessing and a curse to be in it. You know, and we've not been blessed with that, I have to say.
I'm going to ask this question to you. Like, I'm processing these days because I'm feeling as though blackness, if you will, is overexposed. And I'll use the Pulitzer Prizes here in the U.S. as an example, where Kendrick Lamar wins Best Music Pulitzer this year. Henry Threadgill won it last year. I imagine maybe 3% of the people who know who Kendrick Lamar is have any idea who Threadgill is. And trying to find this middle ground in which blackness doesn't seem overexposed, but it's also not obscure. And you know, I liken it to thinking about a film like Moonlight as being that sweet spot in the way that Black Panther is overexposure, right? In the way that in the relative scope of things, a John Akomfrah film might be a little obscure in that context.
No, Ryan, you know, more power to him, man. You know, it's a phenomenal achievement. But lots of people have called up since Panther went out saying, oh, you know, we want to interview you because you're one of the 6 precursors. I'm like, no. I'm not. Last Angel history, it may be a futurist parable, but it sure as hell it's no.
When I tell you, when I saw that last episode of Black Mirror that depicted that particular story, I'm like, okay, whoever did this, watch The Last Angel in history.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, there, you know, it clearly has put some sweetener, some milk in the coffee, so, you know, clearly, right? But we're not the same. I mean, I have no Floyd Webb, who worked with me from Chicago on Last Angel, you know, sent me this long email. He wanted to know what I thought about Panther. I'm like, bro, it's too late. It's not really. Nobody cares what I think.
That's interesting.
You know, 1.5 billion people like it. Enjoy the ride.
Right.
You know, enjoy the ride. I mean, I have issues, not with the film, but with the exposure you're talking about.
Right.
And not necessarily in its own terms. The question is, at what expense is all this light? What is the darkness?
Right. That's a
to all
great
this light?
right.
You know, like what's being pushed into the shadows here? Let's be absolutely clear about this. And usually that dynamic, that really complicated chemistry between the popular and unpopular has to be maintained because the unpopular feeds this stuff.
Right.
So if it's getting no oxygen, there's trouble.
There's trouble. Yeah.
There's trouble. You know. So that would be my issue.
Yeah.
My issue. It's like, where's the oxygen for the non-commercial?
Yeah.
Yeah. The unpopular, the crazy.
Yeah.
Where is that? And if it's been starved, not sure what that means for the ecology
Right.
that we call black culture. I'm not sure.
What's next for Smoking Dogs?
Ooh, war, I think. I'm off to the First World War. So many people. My grandfather fought in it. So Bolden has kind of made me interested in the turn of the century.
Okay.
I just want to feel some of the seismic shifts that happen at that point. You know, so 1905 to 1918 is an interesting point.
A period we don't talk about a lot.
No, and we know what that means, both here and
Right.
and elsewhere in the diaspora. It's a moment of Garvey, it's a moment of the UNIA, and all
Birth
kinds
of,
of stuff.
Birth of a nation.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff. You know, so I'm suddenly kind of fascinated by it. We probably will not get all of it into this one project. I'm just interested in the small rivers that fed into the First World War and the ones that flowed out of it.
Right.
And then we just have to pick up the rest
Think about it.
after that. You know?
Well, as always, it's been a pleasure,
Oh,
John.
man.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
We've been joined by filmmaker John Akomfrah here on Left of Black. Thank you for joining us, John.
Oh, pleasure. Always.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for watch. And